Yeah, that day I was driving my 1966 Mustang from New Jersey to Syracuse, New York. And I was on my way to taking a summer school class at Syracuse University where I had just graduated. It hadn't rained in quite some time, and while I was on the highway, it started to rain. And being familiar with roads that haven't been rained on for a while, I knew that there's an oil accumulation that happens if it doesn't rain for a while. So I was driving very carefully. In spite of that, when I went around a slight bend in the road, my car started to fishtail and I lost control of the car. And I was going below the speed limit, but at that time, the speed limit was about 75. I was going 60, which was probably faster than I should have been going in the rain. And so as the car fishtailed, I wasn't able to correct the fishtail. And it went sideways and then it started flipping over. And from what the onlookers told me, it flipped over about 8 times. So as the car was flipping over, I had a sense that I was going to die. I wasn't even wearing a seatbelt. And at one particular point, I just let go of the wheel and figured this is it. And just completely let go and figured I'm dying here. At that moment, I had what we call in the field a life review. And so my life flashed in front of me. And I could see everything from when I was born through my whole life until the end when I was going to die. It happened very quickly, and so I wasn't able to recall very much afterwards. But as I learned over the years, it was a very traditional kind of life review. I've listened to and read stories about other people who have had life reviews. Excuse me. Mine sounded very similar to a lot of other people who I've heard tell their story. And so anyway, finally the car stopped rolling over, and as you and the listeners might come to understand, I did not die in that accident. And so the car ended up in the middle of the road. It was a big highway, so fortunately there was an area of grass in between the direction I was going and the opposite direction. My fear as I was rolling over was that I was rolling over into the oncoming traffic, and so I was just waiting to be hit by a truck or a car from the other direction with the ongoing traffic. Fortunately, I ended up in this grassy area that separated the two directions of the highway, and the car was on its side, so the door was up above me, above my head. And so I was able to open the door above me and then climb out of the car. And that's what when I noticed that there were a lot of cars that had pulled over to the side of the road to, I guess, help me or help the situation, whatever they felt they could do. And that's when they told me that the car had flipped over at least 8 times, and they really expected that I would have died or been seriously injured. And in fact, I wasn't injured at all. There was a little red scrape on the lower right side of my back, and that was it. I just had no injuries whatsoever. It was really miraculous. And I called a friend of mine who was living in Syracuse at the time, and he drove out to get me and take me back to Syracuse. And he brought a camera with him. So I've got 20 or 30 pictures of the accident site and the car and the condition it was in, and it was pretty extreme. So that was my near-death experience. It was a very remarkable thing. I didn't really think about it very much. At the time, I must have been in shock. But over the years, I came to realize that this was truly a remarkable, almost miraculous incident, that not only didn't I die, but I wasn't really even hurt. So, became very grateful over the years of being watched over, in a sense, in that situation.
And has that incident opened the doors for you to maybe seek some answers as to what had happened that day, or become more spiritual? What were the after effects for you like?
The after effects were unexpected, and it the after effects began with a series of events that I could definitely have not predicted. The first event was actually going to Woodstock, the music festival. Being in Syracuse, New York, it wasn't a very long drive to get to Woodstock, and a couple friends of mine had an extra ticket. They invited me to go with them, and it ended up being a really amazing experience. And then when I got back from Woodstock, it had kind of inspired me to look up an old friend of mine who was living in Syracuse at the time, an old girlfriend. And when I went to visit her, she told me about a meditation group that she had joined. She had actually joined 2 meditation groups. One was a yoga-based meditation group, and the other one was a Kabbalah-based meditation group. And the Kabbalah being the esoteric, the mystical tradition of the Jewish religion. And I confided in her that I would be very interested in attending those classes, those groups, because I had had a lifelong fear of dying, and it had gotten to really epidemic proportions. This was the year of 1969 that all of this was happening. And in the colleges back in those days, Eastern meditation and Eastern religion and different traditions like that, esoteric traditions, not just from the East but from the West as well, were being presented particularly to college people who were very, very interested in those things. So the timing was good for me. My fear of death had reached epic proportions, and by visiting my old friend who was now attending meditation groups, it gave me the opportunity to explore these different meditative traditions that very directly dealt with death and dying, the relationship of life and death, and so forth and so on. And I felt intuitively that by learning these different meditation approaches and studying the different traditions, that I would eventually be able to overcome my fear of dying. And so as I began to attend these groups, I indeed did start a meditation practice. And what I ended up doing, not unexpectedly, was combining the yoga style meditation with the Kabbalah style meditation. And at the same time, I was being introduced into mindfulness, that present moment attention, present moment awareness. So I was really combining those 3 different traditions: the yogic, which is really comes from the Hindu tradition; the mindfulness, which really comes from the Buddhist tradition but is much, much older than Buddhism; and the Kabbalah, which comes from the Jewish tradition. And so for me, it was a very interesting time during my life. At the same time that I was doing the meditation practices, I was, of course, reading every book I could get my hands on, having to do with these various esoteric traditions. During that period of, I guess, a year and a half, 2 years, I must have read hundreds of books having to do with every conceivable subject you can imagine related to esotericism and life and death and meditation traditions and so forth and so on. For me, what happened next, I thought was very usual. I learned over the years that it was very unusual. And so what happened next was spontaneously, without really me trying, I started to have visions and out-of-the-body experiences. Now, I was familiar with these things because I was reading about them, but I never really expected that I would have those kinds of experiences. Here I was, a person who had no knowledge, really, no background whatsoever of any of these things. And yet I was beginning to have these mystical kinds of visions with Jesus and angels and so forth and so on, and other dimensions, other worlds, going out of the body. When I started having the out-of-body experiences, that started to pique my memory about when I was a young child. I would say from the age of 7 or 8 to the age of maybe 14, when I started to hit puberty. What I remembered was that as a young child, when I would go to bed, I would lie in bed and I would just get very, very focused. And it would bring me into a state where I would feel pins and needles all over my body. And then I would start to see little dots of multiple colors. And once I saw the colors, I knew that the next step was going to be an out-of-body experience. And sure enough, that's what was happening. And I was able to reproduce this nightly as a child, whenever I wanted to. So I would lay in bed, I would just come to this very focused, very present moment experience. I would feel the pins and needles, I would see the dots of colors, and the next thing I knew, I'd be out of my body, I'd be up in the corner of the room or whatever, and then off into some other world, some other dimension. Did not have a lot of memory about my travels out there, but definitely remembered the sequence that I would go through in order to have those experiences. When I reached puberty, the ability to do that gradually went away. I can remember trying to do it, and it becoming gradually harder to do, and then I came to the point where I just couldn't do it anymore, and I stopped trying to do it. And it didn't return until this time in my life in 1969, when I was 21 years old, and facing my fear of dying, and then being lucky enough to fall into these groups that were teaching me ways of meditation and knowledge, and then having these experiences of out-of-body and visions and past life flashes, and I didn't know what to call it at the time, but remote viewing. I was able to remote view in a very, very unusual kind of way, much different than the remote viewers that we heard about with the Stargate program that got organized in the 1970s. And that's a whole other story. Through a series of coincidences, I ended up getting introduced to a parapsychologist from Duke University who was recruiting people for the Stargate program. And when I told him about some of my experiences, he asked me if I would come into the New York City office. At the time I was living in New Jersey, and meet people in the Stargate program. And I did. And it was very interesting. I didn't know it was connected to the CIA at the time. I thought they were just doing parapsychology research and remote viewing research, and I for sure was having remote viewing experiences that were far beyond any of the remote viewing experiences that the people were having at the time in the Stargate program. So I kind of went off on a tangent there. But so I was having all of these experiences, which ended up being available to me for the next 22 years, I would say. So I would say from the year 1969 to 1992, I had these experiences on a very regular basis, almost nightly. I guess now would be a good time to maybe zero in on some of the key experiences. As you might guess, 23 years of these kinds of experiences, I've got a lot of journals filled with information. And as we're talking, I will try to just weed out some of the ones that come to my attention right now and strike me as being things that could be of interest to you and your listeners and viewers. So what comes to mind first, besides the remote viewing, is when I would go out of the body, many times I would end up attending, for lack of a better word, a university. There was a school that I would go to, and it struck me as being an expansive school that covered many subjects. And the classes were taught by various teachers from different traditions, from different dimensions. Some of them seemed to be of the earth and some of them seemed not to be. And there were other, I hesitate to say people in the classes, I'll say there were other beings in the classes. Some of them struck me as being earth-like and some of them not so much. And so over all of these years, I'm attending these classes. And the main subjects that I was learning about, I guess you could say, would be called cosmology, or essentially learning about how the universe works and its relationship to how things work here on planet Earth. So many, many years of taking lessons and listening to lectures and having many, many different experiences which taught me how the universe works and how the Earth works and what the relationship was. From time to time, after class, the teacher would take us out on, I guess, what I would call field trips. And I don't remember having a body during these field trips. For me, it was just pure consciousness with absolutely no body whatsoever, just pure awareness. And so we would go out onto these field trips and explore different stars and planets and so far and so forth. And that's when I first learned about the concept of multiple dimensions, because I could see all of the dimensions on every heavenly body, whether it be a planet or a star. My vision was such that I could see each dimension on each star, on each planet. I could see the life that was going on in each dimension. And I learned that if I wanted to experience what was going on in each dimension, I could take what I call the material, the matter, the material of each dimension. I could create a body of that particular material, and I could inhabit that body, and then I would be able to fully experience what was going on in that particular dimension, rather than to just see it and understand it. So there was a lot of intuitive understanding, a lot of nonverbal understanding that came to me in these kinds of experiences. In addition to my classes on understanding the universe, I would go off by myself after class. So I guess you could say my university major was cosmology and understanding the universe. My minor turned out to be learning how to die without fear. And so after class, I would go off by myself, and I would be put in situations where I knew I was going to die. Just like in the car crash, I just knew I was going to die. And sure enough, in each situation, I would either fall off a cliff or die in a nuclear explosion or get shot and so forth and so on. And by the way, let me add that all of these experiences, they did not seem haphazard. It seemed to be very organized, like a laid out curriculum for me. There was definitely a very rational sequence of unfolding here, and I definitely had the sense that this was a very organized curriculum that I was following, and that perhaps many other people were following as well. And so each time that I would be placed in a situation where I knew I was going to die, the fear would come up. And every time the fear came up, I would find myself back in my body. Well, over the years with practice, I was able to get to a point where I could hold off the fear. And I would go a little bit further, and there would be a white light that I could enter into. And then over more time, I got to the point where I could die with absolutely no fear whatsoever. And so I continued to have these death experiences. And once I was able to anticipate the death without fear, to actually go through the dying without fear, I would be able to enter the white light and actually completely go through the white light, pop out the other end, and find myself out there in the universe again, where I was able to choose where I would want to go. And it was during these experiences that I learned the importance of being able to focus and pay attention, which relates to my studies and my practices with mindfulness, which is all about being able to keep one's attention in the present moment. So this is how I learned about attention. I also learned about attention through remote viewing, because when I would do remote viewing, if I wasn't able to hold my attention to where I wanted to be, I would just be going hither and thither. Hither and there, is that the expression? So I wouldn't be able to control where I would be going. It turns out that there are tides and currents in the universe, just like there are in our ocean. You go into the ocean, we know that there are waves, there are tides, there are currents. The same thing exists in the universe out there, in different dimensions. At least that was my experience. I tend to tell people what reality is. I'm just telling you what my reality is through my own particular experiences. Everybody needs to figure out what's real for them. And so when I would go through the white light, pop out the other end, I learned how important it was to be training my attention. And I was already in the process of training my attention through my mindfulness practice and the other meditation practices that I was doing. So I got pretty good at being able to focus my attention and go here and go there without being subject to the various currents and tides that were out there that you could be subject to if you weren't really trained in how to traverse in these other dimensions. And so let's see, those are the experiences that have stayed with me the most and that really pop out as being the most important to me, to who I am and to who I've become. Another interesting thing that I learned is that where I was learning things out of the body, it took a while for them to filter into my body, into my physical body. So there was I call it a lag time. So for example, by the time I overcame my fear of dying out of the body, I realized that I still had some fear of dying while I was in my body. So it seems to me that it takes time for the cells in the physical body to go through whatever transformation it needs to go through in order to adapt to the experiences that are happening out of the body. So I hope I explained that clearly. And so gradually over time, it did happen that while I was in my body, while I'm in my body, I no longer have that fear of dying. But it took a number of years for that experience out of the body to translate and transform my physical body. And so that was an important thing that I learned that I'd like to impart to other people as well, because I've talked to many people about these things, and a lot of people think that once you've had an experience out of the body that it's going to 100% translate while you're in the body, and that has not been my experience. My experience has been that there is an integration period that needs to take place, and that it's gradual, and that it's different for everybody. So I'm just kind of putting it out there for people who are interested in these things, and I'm assuming everybody that's listening and watching you are interested in these things. Let's see, what else comes to mind? Well, I mentioned earlier my experiences with Jesus and angels and so forth and so on. And before I get there again, let me add this. I mentioned that I had these experiences from 1969 to 1992. Let me be clearer about that. Those experiences continue to present day, but not with the frequency that I had during those 20 some odd years. During those 20 some odd years, it was almost a daily occurrence or a nightly occurrence. Nowadays, not so much, but it still happens. For example, just 3 days ago, I had an experience where somebody came up to me and asked permission to shoot me in my forehead and kill me. And I said, wait a minute, let me make sure that I won't have fear if you do that. And I needed to kind of make an adjustment because I hadn't died recently, yuck, in that way. And so I said, okay, I'm ready now, go ahead. So he shot me in the forehead. Sure enough, I died. And I ended up in another dimension, and he was in the other dimension with me. And he said, congratulations, you passed. And he gave me a certificate of completion. And he said, you're done now. You're done. And that just happened 3 days ago. And so it's been a gradual unfolding for me over all these years. The intensity being the first 23 years, and then the gradual integration of all of these experiences. From 1992 until present day. I fully expect that these things will continue to unfold for the rest of my life and continue to have these experiences. And frankly, I would say the last 2 or 3 years, it's begun to intensify again. And if I may share my observation, noticing that there's a synchronicity between my own experiences and what's going on in the world. And if I may speculate, that the quickening of my own experiences these last 2 or 3 years seems to parallel what's happening on the planet. I'm coming across many, many more people who are not only open to these kinds of things, but who are having amazing experiences. It's always different, but there seems to be a mass awakening that I've noticed has intensified over the last 2 or 3 years. And like I said, maybe it's just a synchronicity for me because it's happening to me, and so maybe I'm seeing it in other people more and more because it's happening to me. But the sense that I get is that it's happening on a very broad basis, a very broad level, and that it is indeed an objective thing that's going on across the planet. So that's just an observation that I've had over the past 2 or 3 years. And the truth be told, until 2 or 3 years ago, I never spoke about these things, ever. Never, ever. So it's been 53 years that I've held these experiences inside of myself without telling anybody about them. But something inside of me shifted 2 or 3 years ago, and it was almost as if I was being pushed to start talking about these things. And so I have consented to do some interviews like the one that we're doing today, to talk about these things, and hopefully to help people who are going through similar kinds of experiences now, having some degree of awakening, and would be helpful to hear about other people's experiences. I know it was very helpful for me to have access to people back in the early days of the 60s and early 70s and so forth, books that I was able to access, teachers that I came across who were familiar with what I was going through. It certainly took the pressure off of me, because there were definitely times way in the beginning in 1969 and 70 where I truly thought I was going insane. And each day was a challenge to get through. I mean, it was difficult for me to put one foot in front of the other. Really, it was, I don't know that I could put a psychological word on it, but if I really had to think of something, I would say that it felt like being on the edge of insanity, maybe psychosis or something like that. And I had to use all my energy just to keep from completely freaking out, to use a 60s expression. I don't know, do they say freaking out anymore?
I think they do.
Yeah. So I was lucky enough to come across a few people who were familiar with what I was going through. I was able to be directed to the books that talked about these things, and so that helped me get through that period of instability, mental and emotional instability, and allowed me to become the person that I am today. Going back briefly to my visions with Jesus and the angels, that has continued to be present for me. Not so much with Jesus, although my experiences with being with Jesus did not take on what we might call a religious bent. It was just, for lack of a better word, a feeling of spirituality and consciousness and pure beingness and that type of thing. The angels, I can still see the angels almost daily, particularly when I'm meditating, and they take different forms. And sometimes I can hear them, sometimes I hear harps, and so I seem to have this strong connection with angels. And so that has stayed with me. And I don't really interact a lot with them to my knowledge. I just see them and I know they're there, and that's that. You mentioned also that you might be interested in hearing a little bit about past life recall. So let's...
For sure, yeah.
Let's move on to that.
But before we do, I wanted to zero in on the fear of death. Because I think as you were talking about being afraid of dying, and especially that it had reached epic proportion, I can't help but think there's so many people that are struggling with this. And I was wondering if you have any advice for people that they could follow.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Over the years, I assumed that the kind of experiences that I was having were very common and everybody was having them. Everybody who's interested in these things, who is interested in various meditation traditions and contemplative esoteric traditions. I figured this is very common, but of course, not talking about it for 53 years, I had no idea that this was not a common occurrence. But for people who are in that situation, who are afraid of dying, my recommendation is to begin with a meditation practice. Pick a tradition that you feel comfortable with, whether it be an Eastern tradition or a Western tradition, something that allows you to fully connect to your body. Here's what I've concluded over the years, and this is why, although I've taught many, many different styles and practiced many different styles of meditations from different traditions, at this point, I'm pretty much limiting my teaching to mindfulness. And here's why. what I discovered was most people are not fully in their bodies. There's a lot of different reasons for that. And usually it has to do with some kind of trauma. Or for me, I was born with the fear of dying. So I was born with that trauma. But not everybody is born with that kind of trauma. But most people in this kind of life here on Earth, have trauma from time to time. And so the way our bodies are set up biologically, this is like Biology 101, so if you'll bear with me with this boring subject. In Biology 101, we learn about the fight or flight response, or fully said, fight, flight, or freeze. That's our survival mechanism. What we've learned through research is that there's this phenomenon going on. Nobody knows what's causing it, but people go into fight or flight for different reasons, and they end up being stuck in fight or flight. So the autonomic nervous system gets hung up in that mode. Now, the way that we cope with going into fight or flight is we also have this ability to disconnect. So we disconnect from the body because we don't want to be there to fully experience the pain and suffering when the saber-toothed tiger catches us. So we disconnect from the body. And so following the reasoning here, if we're stuck in fight or flight, then we're also stuck disconnected from the body. So for some people, they're fully disconnected. Some people are partially disconnected, just a little bit. The ones that are fully disconnected, we put a label on them. We call that PTSD. But there are various grades, various levels of PTSD, going all the way from fully disconnected to just a little bit disconnected. With mindfulness practice, it's all about attention to the present moment, but in a very particular way. So with mindfulness practice, we're paying attention to four basic things: the body, physical sensations, the five senses, the thoughts, the emotions, and the breath. The reason that we pay attention, in my opinion, the body in this way is because of that old saying, maybe you've heard this before, where attention goes, energy flows. I'm guessing that your viewers and listeners have heard this before. And I learned a lot about that when I was out of the body. But it also applies very much when you're in the body. And I find that attention is one of the main attributes to, for lack of a better word, our spiritual essence. It's one of the attributes of our spiritual essence. It's pure being and the ability to focus attention. So if energy goes where attention goes, if energy flows where attention goes, if you place your attention on your body and that attention being connected to your spiritual essence, that energy of what you are, it's going to gradually draw that spiritual essence of who you are into the body through the medium of attention. This was a big deal. This is a big deal of what I learned through all of my experiences. And what I've learned not just from my own experiences, but from the thousands of people that I've taught this mindfulness practice to, is that through this medium of attention and by bringing that energetics of the spirit into the body, it starts to break down all of the stress and the fear that comes from being stuck in the fight or flight mode. And fear being the main emotion that comes with fight or flight. And of course, since it's hooked up to the survival instinct, it's fear of dying, because we need to have that fear of dying in order to be well equipped to survive. The fear of dying is a great motivator. You just don't want to walk around with it all the time. You just want it there when you need to survive, and then you let go. So we don't want to get rid of fight or flight. We just want to put it in its place. Just use it when we need it. And so I've learned through my own personal experience and through teaching and the experiences of others that this practice, this meditation practice of attending to the body, brings the energetics into the body. For those Kundalini practitioners out there, it's sort of like a Kundalini practice, because when you bring that spiritual energy into the body, it lights up the chakras and the meridians, and it completely transforms the energetic system in the body as you're bringing that spiritual essence through the medium of attention into the body. And so for me, a good place to start would be that mindfulness practice. And with mindfulness, it's not just a form of meditation. It's also a practice of bringing that present moment body attention into your everyday activity. And the reason that that's so important is because I've noticed many people get stuck in meditation. They feel great when they're meditating, and when they're not meditating, not so great. And that's because they haven't built the bridge between their meditation skill set and their everyday activity. So when I'm teaching, I make a point of emphasizing the importance of bringing that skill set into everyday experiences. An example would be using that present moment attention when you're brushing your teeth, when you're walking, when you're out shopping, when you're driving your car, when you're eating a meal, when you're communicating with other people, so forth and so on. So it's not just a meditation practice. It's a way of being 24/7. So you start out in the stress mode, you end up coming out of the stress mode and into balance. And then if you continue with your practice, you go from that stress-less, balanced experience into what we call flow states. And I'm sure everybody is familiar with the term flow states, peak performance, being in the zone, so forth and so on. So I would encourage people to start with mindfulness. At least for me, it's been very, very effective. But in truth, I've had those other traditions that I've practiced as well. And so maybe in combination with mindfulness, if you are drawn to other practices in addition to mindfulness, to follow your intuition there. But I would look at mindfulness and I would say to the folks, look at mindfulness as being the linchpin, the hub of the wheel, and that if you are grounded in your body through your practice of mindfulness, any other practice that you do is going to be enhanced, and it's going to be way more successful for you if you do it through the embodiment of your mindfulness practice. So for example, if you want to practice Kundalini Yoga, first you want to make sure that you're fully connected to your body. Because a lot of these other practices are really designed to take you into altered states, and maybe even in some extreme cases, take you out of body. And that's easy. The hard part is being in the body. So you want to make sure that you've always got your mindfulness practice, which keeps you connected to the here and now, which is the body, because the body is the gateway to the present moment. So you want to make sure that you're fully connected to your body, and then no matter what other practice, whether you want to call it spiritual practice, meditation practice, any other practice that you do, you're going to be way more successful with it, with far fewer problems and headaches coming, because there are a lot of practices out there that are very interesting, you learn a lot from, but can cause some difficulties as well. Everybody out there has had that. These practices are not always easy. In fact, most of the time, they're not easy at all. It takes work, and it takes commitment, and it takes repetition and practice to do these things. But if you're anchored in your body, and that's your foundation, and you go into these other practices, you'll be way more successful with far fewer issues coming up. So that would be my recommendation as far as overcoming the fear of dying, because I found that overcoming the fear of dying was directly related to my physical body. I guess that's a fairly obvious statement, but it was being stimulated by the biology of the body, by the fight or flight response, which is part of our DNA makeup. It's in our genes. And so we're wired up to be afraid of death. Once we're in a situation like that, and if you end up being stuck in fight or flight, like most of us are to some degree, there's going to be that fear of dying. For me, I was probably born with that PTSD experience because I was afraid of dying as far back as I can remember. And, it wasn't until later in life that I found out that my mother had a nervous breakdown when she was pregnant with me, and that might have offset my autonomic nervous system right from the get-go. But it's a different situation for everybody. But once you address your biology, your genetics, your DNA, you come out of the fight or flight mode, you're going to lose the fear of dying. And along with that, you could very possibly have experiences that would be similar to mine in different degrees. And that would allow you to deepen your feeling of being sure that there's really no need to be afraid of death, because death is, yes, your physical body is going to die, but you're not your body, and you're way more than that, and the part that you are is certainly not going to die, and it's going to go on forever. So that's how I would recommend addressing fear of death for the folks out there.
So I wanted to get back to your past life memories. Was there any experience from a past life that was quite remarkable to you, that you were quite interested in? And did you get to understand how it connected to your current lifetime?
Yeah, so as you ask the question, one does come to mind. But let me preface this by saying that I have a completely different understanding of reincarnation than what's out there. And it has to do with the concept of everybody being interconnected. I'll just leave it at that because I could go on for hours talking about that. But if everybody just considers for a moment that we're all interconnected, then the traditional idea of reincarnation kind of falls to the wayside of it being separate incarnations of personalities and individuals, because there's a blending that takes place. So I'll just say that, just to kind of lay the foundation. So, but with that being said, I'll talk about a memory that I had regarding a lifetime in Egypt. I won't say my lifetime because of what I said about the interconnectedness, but I'll say memory of a lifetime in Egypt. When I was a child, I had multiple dreams of wandering through the desert and getting very tired. And each time I went to sit down and rest, I would sit on the point of a pyramid. And this was a repeating dream throughout my childhood. It wasn't until I started with my practices and put my foot on the path that I started having those dreams again. Only this time, when I went to sit down and rest in the sand on the point of the pyramid, I said, you know what, I'm going to start digging out the pyramid. So I would start digging out the pyramid. And then over a number of years, as I kept digging out the pyramid, I finally got to the point where the entire pyramid was uncovered from the sand. And I found the door to the pyramid and found a way to open the door of the pyramid. And it was, being that it was hermetically sealed, when I opened the door, I could hear a hissing sound. It's almost like opening up a jar of peanuts that's been sealed, and you hear that hissing sound when you open up the jar of peanuts. So I could hear that sound, and I could smell the dampness that was in the pyramid. And once that door was open, I started to explore the pyramid, and each time I would explore different parts of the pyramid. I would go through, for lack of a better word, different initiations, which would affect my consciousness. And this went on for a number of years as well. I don't know exactly how many, although I've journaled all these experiences. Someday maybe I'll go back in the journals and look, but I just don't feel motivated to do that right now. So I went through these initiatory experiences in the pyramid. I assume it corresponded to the Great Pyramid. Coincidentally, over the years, I formed an archaeological nonprofit that funded projects on the Giza Plateau with the Great Pyramid and worked with some very famous archaeologists having to do with Egypt and so forth and so on. And so going through the initiatory experiences in the pyramid really opened me up to having an intuition and a very close feeling of what it was like to be in Egypt in the old days, what things were like and what the various meditation processes were back then and so forth and so on. And then up to this day, I still feel very, very close to the Egyptian thing. In fact, I mentioned to a friend of mine that one of the very famous archaeologists that I worked with, his name is Zahi Hawass, who's actually head of archaeology in Egypt now, is coming to Arizona to give a talk. And this friend of mine said, why don't we go to the talk? I said, I've been there, I've done that. I feel like I carry Egypt around with me all the time wherever I go. So no, I'm not really interested, but you go. So that's kind of how I feel. I feel like I carry Egypt around with me all the time. And as a result of those dreams, which morphed into out-of-body experiences, which morphed into the initiatory consciousness experiences that I went through over the years in the pyramid. So that was what comes to mind when you ask what comes to mind with past life. With the caveat that, once again, I have a different view of reincarnation and past lives, and so I'll never say in my life in Egypt. I'll say in a life in Egypt, this is what I experienced. I do have a website, and it's called Stress Beaters. So stressbeaters.com. And there's a way to contact me by phone or by email on my website. Thank you.